This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. The political gains of the Arab Spring will be undermined if there aren't new economic systems to sustain the new democratic political systems. The old economic models of the Middle East were designed to support authoritarian elites. But writing in Prospect magazine, Claire Spencer argues that a new and more participatory politics in the region needs a new and more participatory economic system. Dr. Spencer is head of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, a London think tank. And she joins us now from our VOA London bureau. Welcome, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, hello.
So how were the old economic models in the region tied to the old politics of the region?
Well, in brief, you could describe it as crony capitalism to different degrees based on patronage, and the fact that when a number of privatization programs took place from the 1980s, there wasn't really an open tendering process, and rather like in Russia, a lot of public assets ended up in private hands, but in circles very close to the regime. Now, this hasn't always been the case, but I think if you look back to 2009, when there was a report from the World Bank, this is before the Arab Spring, where they were talking about from privilege to private-led growth by saying that the private sectors are actually privileged elites who are not yet subject to the rules of the market, where regulatory frameworks exist in principle, but they're not applied in practice, and where it's who you know, not what you know, that actually gets business done. Now, some attempts, certainly since last year, have been made to, if you like, tackle this, but it's the systemic corruption, I think, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, where you would expect there to be more movement now. I think some of the pre-existing economic elites are still there. And it's very difficult to see, even with a change, if you like, in the political layer, how they're going to tackle this very structural problem.
And indeed, the economic issues seem to have a lot to do with the spark for the Arab Spring, with the fruit salesman in Tunisia who killed himself really because of government restrictions on his ability to make a living and engage in commerce.
Yes, indeed, where you rely on having a patron in order to get yourself a license to trade, that kind of thing is very tricky. You need an open marketplace, you need people to be able to rise up through the system on merit. And at the moment, the main program, everybody internally, externally is talking about, both in Tunisia and Egypt and further afield, indeed in Morocco, is to extend credit lines for small and medium enterprises. But unless you cut out the middlemen in these situations and create the environment and the business culture for small and medium enterprises to thrive, you may fall back in the same trap of people further up the system, if you like, controlling access to markets and credit.
When you write about, in Prospect magazine, you write about how in Egypt the systems that deliver foodstuffs and fuel to the poor at subsidized prices are controlled, and traditionally have been controlled in Egypt by the military, and that's part of the control that the military then has had over the country.
Well, the subsidies come from central government budgets, but they're a kind of blanket remedy and alleviation, if you like, for the third of the population, or up to 40% of the population, who are on the poverty line. The problem is they apply to everybody, so very cheap bread is accessed by the rich and poor alike. And I think the World Bank and others would argue that more targeted programs that genuinely alleviate the poor and get them out of poverty would be a better use of state resources, particularly since they use at present 25% of current spending. And this is subsidies on fuel. The very poor don't actually have access to motor vehicles. It is the richer of society who benefit from cheap gas prices.
And what's your sense of the new government in Egypt and its willingness to entertain market reforms?
Well, I think what's interesting in the last few weeks is that where it seemed that the military, through the SCAF, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, was still controlling political affairs in Egypt, the elected president, President Morsi, from a Muslim Brotherhood background and supported by the Muslim Brotherhood majority party, has now, if you like, negotiated with them and has taken over the reins of government. But the military still remain very embedded in the economy. There are all sorts of speculations as to how much of the economy they control. The key point, I think, is that they still control the issuing of licenses for trading and for setting up businesses, and also access to land, which is critical for anyone to setting up new plant and new factories. So it seems to me that negotiation with the military also has to take place, whereby I imagine they'll safeguard some of their economic interests, but they will not be able to interfere, hopefully, directly in who gains access to credit and land and trading licenses in the way they have in the past. But that is yet to happen. That is a reform which needs to take place.
And what should those reforms look like when you're trying to make it more possible for people to get licenses to do business? How do you set those kinds of licensing systems up in a way that doesn't foster corruption, that actually makes it possible for average people to go out and start a business in a reasonable time frame?
Well, I believe the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has actually got a program looking at the trading environment for small and medium enterprises. And I think the whole thing is based on cutting out the middleman, doing things at the local level so that you don't have a whole bureaucratic system where at each level somebody can take their slice of the action, that somebody can act as a blockage. In countries like Morocco, they've set up one-stop shops so that you can go directly to different regional development authorities to set up businesses. You don't need to go through central government. So I think that kind of thing is the way forward. But I think it's also the debate on where economics goes in these countries takes place in an environment where the global economy itself is under stresses and strains. And unfortunately, the credibility of outside partners like the IMF, the World Bank and others who give these sort of liberal prescriptions are not always very popular, where private sector development and the business community have themselves been seen as part of the corruption of the former regime, and obviously those who've kind of gone undercover recently but are still there trading. So I think it's a very hard debate to have in societies who feel they're on the receiving end of the global downturn, as everybody else feels.
Well, the U.S. State Department is organizing some business trade delegations to go to Egypt to try to foster new economic development there. Are there ways that that the U.S. or other Western groups trying to promote trade can do so in a way that actually promotes non-corrupt, open trade market kinds of reforms in these countries?
I think it's a long struggle, because obviously in my article I also talked about parallel economies, up to 40% or more of the economies of Morocco and Algeria and other states, and I'm not sure of the exact total in Egypt, but also in Egypt, are outside government fiscal nets. They exist in parallel. And so this informality of economic practice, this personalization of business relations, should be looked at in ways that can be turned to be an asset, and that every player understands that if everybody is regulated under the same laws and the same regulations, that a level playing field will benefit everybody. But I think it requires quite a lot of legwork for outsiders like the US, like Europe, to get to know some of the new actors and not actually rely on tried and tested contacts, particularly in the larger businesses within the region, because they themselves may well have an interest in perpetuating the current situation.
We only have a few seconds left, but what are the challenges, especially to a country like Libya, where you have an oil-based economy that so naturally lends itself to being sort of captured by a few elites?
Well, obviously, as in the days of Gaddafi and now, the large part of the revenues of Libya will come from hydrocarbon exports. 97% of state revenues came from the exports of oil and gas. Therefore, it seems to me imperative that mechanisms are set up in order to reinvest that money in infrastructure, in the creation of other economic activities and sectors, so that more people can have a stake in the economy. Once you have a single source of income, the risk is that the proceeds fall into very few hands, and that is a recipe for a return to authoritarianism.
Dr. Claire Spencer of Chatham House, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.